Hello. Back when we started the podcast, we had several requests for content on the KSA portfolio. Rather than do a series of videos or podcast episodes on the KSA, particularly given that they might not be the most entertaining topic ever, we have decided to launch the KSASSISTANT web app. All you need to know beforehand is whether you are doing a full or condensed KSA and whether you're submitting it to an accredited university course or directly to the BABCP. From then on, KSASSISTANT will do all the heavy lifting for you, removing all the pieces of guidance that you don't need to see, letting you choose between the pathways that are available to you, tracking your progress, and giving you access to a sample KSA. People who have used KSASSISTANT so far have spoken about how it helped them stop overthinking and start compiling their KSA. Access to KSASSISTANT costs £7 a year, billed on an annually recurring subscription. If you'd like to find out more, head to twolostsouls.co.uk/KSASSISTANT, a link will be in the show notes, and feel free to share it with anyone you know is starting or in the midst of their KSA. Now, on with the episode. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, whenever and wherever you are listening. This is an episode of the Two Lost Souls podcast, all about politics in the therapy room. My name is Ravi Amrith, and joining me, as usual, in the therapy room today, making her triumphant return to the Two Lost Souls podcast, is the superb Michelle Sudbury. Hello, Shell.
Hiya, Ravi. Feels like it's been a long time since I've been here.
It feels like it's been a long time. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm good. So, I'm going to guess that lots has happened since you were last on the show.
Lots and lots, yeah. So I've had a couple of big kind of work-related things happen. Can I do a little bit of self-promotion? Is that all right?
Of course you can, of course.
Thanks. So I've been completing the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Senior Leadership Apprentice, and I have passed that. So very chuffed.
I'm going to stop you there for a second. Did you just pass it?
No, I got a distinction, Ravi. Yeah, so I'm really, really proud. It's been a lot of work, but fantastic. If anybody's thinking about going on to the EGA, I would highly recommend it. One of the best bits of training I've ever done. So yeah, and I'm going to go on to my master's, I think. So very exciting. Nice times.
Amazing. Well, what are the sorts of things that you took from that training?
I think for me, I was quite an inexperienced person working in the role of a manager, leader. And I think having that support to really develop skill to help me to become the kind of leader that I want to be, really, has been my biggest takeaway. I don't know, in the NHS, you're kind of thrust into these roles. You find yourself suddenly one day in the position of, a team lead or a supervisor or a service manager, as it is now. And you end up there with, and you're not really sure how you've gotten there or what you're doing. And it's very much a learning on the job. So you bring along yourself, your core stuff, you bring that with you, but none of the kind of other things that you really need. So yeah, it's been really, really important over the last couple of years for me. I would really recommend it.
Well, yeah. I suppose we have done some episodes in the past on how CBT skills are useful outside of the therapy room, perhaps in other industries, and we are looking to do some more content around onward career journeys. So I suppose to hammer that message home a bit, and what were the, I suppose, skills that you already had that you think would continue to serve as being very useful when you find yourself in leadership?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the skills that I already had, I am quite a compassionate person, I think, by nature, for the most part. And extending that out into compassionate leadership, I think, has been, that's been a journey. Learning to balance kind of operational expectations, versus kind of workforce expectations. And the other big thing about the programme that I've just completed is the focus on how others might experience me and how I might want others to experience me. And that's kind of a golden thread that runs through the whole of the kind of the training. And that in itself has helped me to kind of really hone things like my reflection skills, kind of eliciting feedback. So if you think about my CBT skills, the elicitation and provision of feedback, I think I've really learned the value of that over the last couple of years, because you can't grow if you don't know those kind of hidden areas. So you need somebody to tell you sometimes, even when they're a bit crap. And I've really enjoyed that. I think it's really helped me to grow and develop. And yeah, long way to go still, but I'm a lot further on than I was. So that's good.
Well, definitely. And I think very useful for people to hear in terms of acknowledging that they are building foundations that can move towards bigger and brighter things. If, you know, the idea of just being a jobbing CBT therapist isn't what someone wants to do for the rest of their life, acknowledging that they're sowing the seeds for something more expansive if they want a career that kind of grows into that. Also, I think you got some feedback for some previous episodes. I thought you wanted to give some shout outs.
I do want to give some shout outs. So as I've mentioned lots and lots of times on here, I'm very lucky. I get to supervise some of our newish trainees in the world of high intensity CBT, and I just wanted to kind of call out three in particular. So all listeners, we've got Danny, Rebecca, Tom. Danny today shared some beautiful feedback on how valuable she's found our podcast in her training journey. She's listened to every episode. She's taken a lot from it, and she's really, really grateful that we've taken the time to do this. And it was just so lovely to hear. I promised I'd share that back, but I think they all deserve a bit of a shout out because they're all doing fantastically. And we're really lucky to have people like that coming into the world of CBT, I think. Yeah.
100%. This is a bit of a cliche, but this show would be absolutely nothing without you listening. And alongside that, as usual, if you did want to provide any feedback to us, or if you had any ideas for things that you'd like to see us cover on future episodes, please email hello@twolostsouls.co.uk. Also, if you go to twolostsouls.co.uk, you can check out our sparkling brand new website and have a look at not only the podcast, but also the other areas that we're trying to grow into to develop other resources that are useful, not only for the training journey, but beyond as well. So feel free to check that out. And without further ado, let's have our conversation all about politics in the therapy room. We have the pleasure of being joined in the therapy room by not one, but two guests today. First of all, we have Dr. Laura Winter, who is a counselling psychologist with special interests in politics and policy work in applied psychology. First of all, welcome to you, Laura. How are you doing?
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, no, lovely to be here, and thank you for the invite to talk about something I'm very interested in.
No worries at all. We also have our first repeat visitor to the therapy room, and definitely the first person who has attended 2 episodes in a row, the clinical lead from the high intensity CBT course at the University of Birmingham and clinical psychologist, Dr. Richard Bennett. Hi, Rich. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for welcoming me back. I'm guessing that's a good thing, right? Something must have gone well last time. So yeah, very, very pleased to be back. Thank you very much.
Well, definitely. Sadly, in our last episode, Michelle was out of action, ill at the time, so we couldn't let me hog all of the Dr. Bennett goodness. And so the opportunity came up to have you on today's episode as well. And I suppose now it's a party or a political party, if you will. No idea where that awful joke came from. Apologies. I'm here all week. Try the veal. The David veal, possibly? No, that's a pun too far, probably. But before I lose myself in a sea of awful dad jokes, let's start with you, Laura. Appreciating that today's discussion will be highly subjective. There are a variety of different viewpoints from which to examine the topic that we will be covering today. What is your position in terms of the lens that you use to view the topic of politics, and what's your standpoint on it?
As a counselling psychologist and as a trainer in counselling psychology, I think I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about my position in the world and how that impacts the work I do. I'm white, I'm pretty middle class, I'm a woman, a cis woman, and I think all of those things influence the way I understand the world, the way I experience the world. I think I've benefited from lots of socially structured advantages. What I always say is, as a woman, I was working in academia from a fairly young age. It felt like I was quite young anyway. Fairly young age, and having a family, I've got 3 small children. I've kind of come up against sexism in the workplace and in psychology a number of times, but I think I also benefit from lots of socially structured advantages. I'm not currently disabled, and those things all impact how I approach this topic.
And Rich, what about you?
Yes, so just from a professional point of view, I'm qualified as a clinical psychologist and a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist, and my sort of work experience is best part of 25 years in the NHS, 15 years in an academic setting, and then probably 10 years or so in private practice. I'm also white, male, cisgendered, straight. In terms of class, I don't know. We didn't have much money growing up, but fairly middle class in the sense that both my parents went to university. So yeah, I think that has definitely conferred certain sort of structural advantages for me, and limitations, right? It also sort of limits the way that I can see the world, and so I'm always open to other views being available. And one of the great things about working in Birmingham and I've been involved with the IAPT, or NHS Talking Therapies course as it is now, since the very beginning, 2008. Been leading that course since 2011. It's a tremendously diverse place to work, and we feel very lucky and privileged to always have very diverse cohorts in all of the ways that you can think about diversity, be that gender or age or ethnicity or sexual orientation. We have a wide range of students. And if I think about some other courses that I teach on, the CBT course is always more diverse, and I always feel very lucky to be part of that.
Shell, is there anything about your background that you'd like to share in terms of helping listeners understand the perspective that you may be sharing today?
Absolutely, yeah. So again, white, female, cisgendered. I do live with disability, so I have a long-term health condition which falls under Disability Act. And I think obviously that comes with some disadvantages, but also advantages in terms of viewpoint and perspective taking. So that's quite useful. Yeah, and I like to think of myself as working class, actually, although my income bracket now would probably put me into a middle class category, but first person in my family to go to university, certainly.
And for my background, I am a South Asian but British-born cisgendered male, predominantly grew up working class, but I suppose similarly to what you've mentioned there, Shell, in terms of where I am now, I suppose I would be classed more as middle class, considering my income bracket, and possibly also, in a way, I'm wondering if the work that I do also kind of pushes me into that bracket of being middle class, in a way. To set our stall out for this, when we talk about politics, it's in the episode title for today's show, it's also the theme of our discussion today. When we say politics, what do we mean?
I think we can define it in lots of different ways. I mean, in the literature, we often see distinctions between small p politics and big P politics. And what people mean when they say big P politics are things like our electoral system, our party politics, what goes on in the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and all of that kind of political infrastructure we have, our MPs and so on. And the small p politics would relate more to kind of everyday power relations in society, the way things are structured in a much more subtle way. Now, pinning that definition down is definitely harder, but I think the distinction is really, really important, because I think sometimes people talk cross wires. When people talk about therapy being political, the way in which we mean political is really important. I know in some of Carl Rogers' later work, he wrote about people having told him that person-centred counselling was really political. and him having been like, no, it's not. But the reason he said it wasn't is because he understood politics as being big P politics. And when he understood it as being about power relations and about the kind of the more subtle way we might think about politics, then he was like, oh yeah, actually it is. What I was doing when I was talking about client-centered approaches was political. So I think that distinction is really important for therapists to understand. And it's not a very solid distinction. I think it's kind of artificial in some ways. And I've spoken before about the ways in which those two kind of ways of thinking about it it's a bit of an artificial line and they do intertwine. But I do think it's relevant for therapists to think about.
Definitely, hence why we're having this discussion today, and to inquire a little bit more about your background, Laura. What is it that first drew you to explore the relationship between politics, with either a big P or a small p, and the goings-on within a therapy room?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. To some extent, it still feels like a fairly recent development in my work. Albeit it's been a few years now. I think I was initially drawn to the way in which the social context interacted with what we were doing in applied psychology, because I was initially focused in my work very much in counselling psychology as a discipline. I'd always had an interest in the social and the political as well as the interest in the psychological, and I kind of thought those two things were separate. So I had a very kind of traditional initial training in psychology. It was all very cognitive and it was all very kind of it was very individualistic, is what I would say now. It was very focused on the individual. And that's how I understood mental health and well-being. And I kind of thought my interest in society and the social was quite separate. So it took me a while to realise that the two were very much intertwined. And my initial work, I suppose, still didn't make that political piece explicit. I was interested in the idea of social justice. I was interested in whether this was a thing for psychology, whether it was what we thought was part of our role, whether we cared about it as psychologists, in a professional sense, I suppose. And it took me a while to realise that the piece that was missing, or the bit that I wasn't naming, was that all of the things that myself and others were talking about, equality, fairness, oppression, those things are all structured by politics. They're all political things. And so that kind of segued into the more recent work, which names that and looks at that more explicitly.
And with that in mind, let's start with the big P, I guess, first of all. How does politics with a big P present itself in the therapy room and impact on what happens as part of a therapeutic dynamic, or as part of the carrying out of therapy?
I mean, I think it comes into the room initially in the same way that anything about our identity comes into the room. You know, we started this discussion by kind of positioning ourselves, and I think we bring so much into the room with us before we've even said anything. It's there, it's implicit, it's sometimes inferred. You know, when I walk into a therapy room and I meet a client for the first time, they will make a whole load of assumptions based on that first interaction. You know, and some of them are based on really tangible things that you can see. I wear a wedding ring, so somebody immediately knows that I'm married. I've worked as a psychologist when I'm pregnant. You can't hide that from the room. You've got a ginormous bump there. So there are some things that come in very obviously, but there are other things that people will read into interactions and make assumptions about you. And we carry them into the room with us, I think. There's research that talks about the way in which big P politics comes into the room very explicitly as well. When Trump was elected for the first time in the US, and there were lots of research studies that kind of came out after that about the way in which clients were bringing issues connected to the election into the therapy room very explicitly. We've seen similar things here in the UK as well. I mean, I was talking just the other week about how when the EU referendum was around as a very hot topic, I don't recall it coming into the therapy room, but I do recall it coming into the teaching room with groups of trainees. So, I mean, this stuff, it can come in implicitly, I think, and it can also come in explicitly.
Given that me and Shell arguably will approach this through the lens of NHS talking therapies, given that that's where we do the bulk of our work, I'm wondering for you, Rich, given that you've kind of got a foot in both camps here, given that you're a clinical lead on the NHS talking therapies course at the University of Birmingham, but a lot of your time is spent in private practice, where you do the majority of your clinical work. How have you noticed that change as part of the segue to private practice? And does that change the way it shows up at all, or change what shows up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if you've only ever worked in the NHS, there is a little bit of a view about private practice like it's somehow the land of milk and honey, and you just, you're coining it in, and all the people you see, like, there's basically nothing wrong with them. I want to give the lie to that. Like, that's a myth. So I think people do have, real problems. They have more financial resource, obviously, because they're paying for it, or they've got some kind of insurance policy that's paying for it. And they are still people impacted by all of the same kinds of things that everybody is impacted, just maybe in a different way. Just to give you a tangible example, being in Birmingham, which is the kind of ground zero for the Raise the Colours initiative. I've suddenly gone from living in what I thought was quite an attractive, slightly leafy part of town to being somewhere that's completely covered in Union Jacks and crosses of St. George. Now, probably this isn't the place to get into the ins and outs of that, because there are people that will say, well, it's all about unity. However, lots of the people associated with that movement do have links to the far right, and there are quite a lot of people that don't believe that it's all about unity. And so I've had clients who are quite disturbed by it from a range of different kind of ethnic backgrounds. They are feeling like they're living in a much more divisive, polarized society as a consequence of that, as well as some other things. And those kind of things, it doesn't matter how much money you've got, that those things can still impact you. So I would say that there are some obvious differences. I mean, you would probably know this better than me, but when I've spoken to many of my supervisees who work in the NHS, they will say that things like wealth inequality and the increasing nature of wealth inequality in our society are becoming much more of a topic of conversation and having to be part of the formulation of what's going on for someone. And obviously that's going to impact NHS clients more than it is private clients. So there are going to be some things that are clearly different, and people are still people, and there are going to be some aspects where issues that are sort of big P political issues are cutting across all sectors of society.
Perhaps the big difference between working as an NHS talking therapist and working in private practice shows up more when we come to the small p in terms of power relations and structures, acknowledging that particularly when it comes to working for NHS talking therapies, we are essentially a juggernaut, or it can at least feel as though we're perceived that way, being a provision that's provided all across the country. The NHS is a logo and a name that everyone is familiar with, but with it comes particular rules, particular regulations, particularly on a service-by-service basis. Things like DNAs and cancellation policies, for example, which can sometimes form quite an ethical dilemma in terms of, as a therapist, wanting to keep someone on in treatment despite the fact that they may have contravened an engagement policy, whereas the service would think, well, where's the ethics in terms of the amount of people waiting to be seen for treatment? So with that in mind, I'm wondering how the small p presents itself, both in private practice and from both of your observations in the NHS as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of infuses everything. I've worked in practice in the NHS and in third sector. I've not done any private work. I see my work as largely very humanistic, even if I'm not practicing a humanistic model of therapy. I understand my conception of what I'm doing is all about the therapeutic relationship, and that therapeutic relationship is just full of political stuff in my mind. It's full of various understandings of how power is going on there, because there is, as you said when you were talking about the NHS and branding, there's role power that goes on in that relationship simply because I am in the relationship of being a practitioner psychologist and they're at the point of being my client or my service user that I'm working with. So there's already a differential there, but then there's a complicated kind of intersectional web of kind of power beyond that, which relates to my own positionality and identity, both visible and invisible, like I said before, but it also, is embedded in a load of history too, and a load of context that we can't escape from any of that we carry that with us into the room. And I think that the therapeutic relationship then becomes very much kind of coloured by all of the small p politics that we're kind of talking about.
This is definitely Laura's wheelhouse more than it is mine. So I did go on Wikipedia, though, in preparation for today and looked up a definition of politics. There was one sentence that I really liked, which was that politics is a set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of way of looking at it. And then once you think about it like that, it's like you can't get away from it, can you? It's absolutely everywhere. It's everywhere where there are groups. So like small p, what could that be? That could be the decisions that get made in your household, for example, and all of the different kind of power dynamics that might play into that through, history and gender and all of those kinds of things. Without wanting to appear too sycophantic, like Laura wrote a paper which is on our reading list for the course. It was just short and elegant, and I really liked it. There was a line in the title about the personal is the political, and you'll be able to speak to that better than me. But that just felt like very useful to think about. You can't really separate the two. Any sort of personal decision you make, none of us is an island. None of us exist in a vacuum. We're all part of social groups. That's just the nature of the sort of fabric of our society. And so any sort of personal decision you make, or any sort of history that you have, is going to be influenced politically in one way or another.
From an NHS standpoint, I suppose. I think when we're talking about politics being decisions made within groups, the NHS is very well known, isn't it, for having quite a hierarchical power structure where decisions are often made in isolation by people with power. And already I think, although we're moving away from that a little bit, luckily, it certainly is going to have an impact, isn't it, on kind of the politics, the small P's in particular, within those environments, because it's quite disempowering. And that in itself is a kind of political, a small p issue, isn't it?
And with that in mind, there strikes me as being an inherent contradiction here, particularly, speaking from the perspective of being a high-intensity CBT therapist. We strive to create a collaborative environment in the therapy room, right? This idea that I'm not an all-knowing expert, to get my daily Richard Bennett quote in, I'm not a guru, I'm a cheerleader. And there are some quotes that often get spoken about, such as, you shouldn't be working harder than the client, but there is a baked in power dynamic in that room. Are we really shooting ourselves in the foot by sort of trying to do both at once?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and not one I think I can answer, and certainly not succinctly. But I do think it's a massive tension in this area, and the reason I was kind of smiling as you were asking it is because it comes up all the time for me. Because essentially, psychology, in its broad sense, is a pretty conservative discipline. There's a really good book. There's a Brian Hughes book that's been published. It's what's it called? Psychology's Quiet Conservatism, and it's all about the idea of the liberal bias in psychology and whether or not we really are liberal as a discipline. And I read that with interest recently because it really drilled into this idea of often psychology is kind of supporting the status quo. The talking therapy service, initially at least, was created and designed because we had loads of people out of work who needed to get back into work. So it wasn't created and designed, albeit all of the people involved with it will have wanted this. But it was, there is an idea behind much of psychology, or baked in, if you like, that we are kind of supporting the status quo sometimes. There's a concern, I think. So when we talk about social justice, or when we talk about kind of politics in therapy, I think there is a real tension there that we can't really escape because of the baked in power relationships, because of the way that services are structured, because of the organisational and systemic pressures. We can be very, we want them for the people we work with, absolutely. But we do work within systems, and those systems themselves are quite conservative.
Just come in on that. I feel that tension daily in my job as course lead. Because again, the political, that personal political thing. Because so here I am, I suppose, and I would identify as being a liberal, humanist kind of person. I guess I believe in things like freedom of belief and freedom of speech and egalitarian and equality, that those are principles that I think are important. And I'm sort of operating inside of this system which has adopted quite a traditional second wave CBT approach to things, which does sort of point the finger at the individual and say, it locates the problem inside of the person, whereas I kind of don't really believe that. Like that's it's quite medical, isn't it? It's like there's something wrong with you that we need to get sorted. And Beck was a psychiatrist, so I guess you can sort of understand where that comes from. Whereas I sort of personally, I think I see things a little differently. We could go down complete rabbit holes with this, couldn't we? But it's like, what is distress? For example, let's think about what that is. And I kind of think, well, that is not being able to facilitate your value-driven aspirations, the sort of the things that you want in life, the things that give you a sense of well-being. And so it's not being able to have those. Traditional CBT, I think, sees the obstacles to you, achieving a rich, full, meaningful life as being inside of you. Whereas I kind of see, that's part of the story, but a lot of what blocks people from achieving their goals and aspirations is structural stuff that's outside of them. And so my personal view about this is really that if we're going to help people, we need to look both within and without. And it's, if someone is struggling, we need to look at the interface between the person and their environment. You can't sort of take a fish out of water and expect it to behave the same. So I think people can only understand people's behavior in terms of the context that they find themselves in. And so yes, some of the answer might be looking inside, but some of the answer might be looking outside. And I feel like traditional CBT doesn't do a good enough job of the latter. So I feel that tension between what I'm supposed to be delivering and my personal sort of view about things. So I think that those kinds of tensions are probably around. It's not going to be just me, right? There's loads of people will have those kinds of tensions. I'm sure that, the two of you working inside of the system, which is it's a great humanitarian project, NHS Talking Therapies in many ways. And when you're in it, there's quite a lot of imperfections and things that probably rub you up in the wrong way at the same time. Both things can be true.
Yeah, no, I think you put that exactly right for me. I think, on the course I teach and on the Counselling Psychology doctorate, we look at this quite a lot. The fact that the medical model has dominated psychology for a long time. We understand distress as individual. And, at the start, Rav, you asked me about the kind of interest in the politics, and I explained it's relatively new. And the one thing that I've kind of become increasingly aware of is it kind of benefits us in psychology. It serves the discipline to think about problems as psychological because that's what we work with. One of the things I often say to trainees, that's a really simple thing that you can do, is just not leave this stuff out of your formulations. Just because you're not going to be acting on it, just because it's not going to be your focus for your intervention, don't leave it out, because the minute you leave it out, the person, as you say, Richard, makes it all feels like it's their thing. So I think there is this tension around it. And there's also, I think, an increasing need for us to frame the social and environmental stuff that we're talking about as political. We talk about social determinants of mental health. CBT formulations will include stuff about the environment on there. But we kind of talk about it like it just exists. I've got this list of social determinants of mental health that I've used in several presentations now. We kind of list them and kind of present them as if they've just happened. And in actual fact, it's political decision-making that means that those things exist. It's not, they aren't products of nature, if you like. They've not just happened. But I think the way in which society and people work means that we forget that. Liberation psychology, one of the principles of that involves drawing attention to and critically examining taken for granted ideas. And I think that's something as within talking therapies, within psychology, that we could do an awful lot more of. Just
to give you a really practical example of that, like the idea that everything is political. So there was an earlier iteration of DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the kind of psychiatric guidebook, where depression, which is obviously framed as a mental illness, and there's lists of symptoms for depression, so sadness, low mood, etc., etc. So you could be diagnosed with depression if you had this list of symptoms, unless you were recently bereaved. So which was obviously problematic, right? Because on the one hand, you're sort of saying, well, this is a mental illness. Oh, unless you've been bereaved, in which case all of these things can happen to you, and it's not a mental illness. And so he's like, well, is it a mental illness or isn't it? Like, what are you saying? Are you saying that this is sort of physiologically determined and it's within the individual, or it's just something that someone can experience subsequent to an adverse event like a bereavement? And, you know, obviously that was a really difficult position to be in. And so what the APA did, the American Psychiatric Association, are responsible for writing this thing, is they just got rid of the bereavement clause. So basically now you can be diagnosed with depression, like you've got a mental illness within a few weeks of losing a loved one. And that just, I mean, it seems nonsensical to me, but it's an obvious sort of political move, right, to kind of shore up the idea of depression being a mental illness. So, you know, and lest we forget, like homosexuality was a mental illness, like in my lifetime. You know, it's obvious really when you start to sort of scratch the surface that all of these things are kind of constructs that have a big political facet to them.
In support, I suppose, of the idea about the tension that's developing between the way that we're working and how we might want to work as therapists, I definitely know that there's an appetite now for much more humanistic, holistic care being offered, and third wave CBT is so much more popular than a second wave CBT amongst new trainees in particular, you know, and I know there's a lot of frustration at being restricted in practice, you know, based on kind of current guidance for those of us working within the NHS talking therapies world. So the political influence on that, I guess, is really interesting to me.
We've mentioned at several points during the show so far that the personal is the political, and I'm sure this is a question that all of us will have some thoughts on. But in your paper, Swimming Against the Tide, Laura, you wrote about therapists being equipped to have conversations with political features. How well equipped are therapists to have these conversations? And I suppose perhaps also to you, following that, Rich, what does the ongoing movement look like to better equip therapists?
So it's an area I think about a lot. I mean, I've worked as a trainer since 2013. And I was a programme director for a number of years. And I do think counselling psychology has a particular flavour to it, in the sense of our programme is quite informed by kind of social justice and intersectionality. And so we do weave it through. But in my research work, when I initially surveyed therapists, it was very clear that they felt unequipped for the moments when politics came in more explicitly, I guess is what I would say. The people that responded to the survey felt very comfortable with the small p politics, not unchallenged, but it was more a core part of what was going on for them, but I think felt more unsure about those moments where politics might explicitly get brought in. And then I've also kind of in more recent work talked to counselling and educational psychologists in both the US and the UK who are engaged in influencing policy. So we're doing kind of what gets called as policy advocacy work as part of their roles as psychologists. And what I thought was really interesting in that one was that people were kind of saying, look, some of our core skills that we are equipping people in, these are really good for these moments. They're really good for policy work. And I can translate that too to thinking it means we're quite well equipped in some ways, because I think the emphasis on our listening skills, our ability to digest information and be quite open and show a lot of empathy, I think they're all really, really core skills for engaging with conversations about politics. The bit that I think we miss is that it's so often not talked about explicitly, combined with a kind of cultural discomfort about politics. It means that people are a little bit more scared of it than they should be, even if they might have some of the skills that would be useful. I think people are very much unsure of saying the wrong thing. I think fear is a big thing. Unsure of saying the wrong thing, unsure of getting into trouble. Is it part of my role? Is it not part of my role? Am I going to trip up? And I think one of the big things increasingly, I suppose, as society becomes in some ways more polarised, is knowing how to manage those moments of disagreement, of tension that might be in the space. I think that's quite a challenge. We had a brilliant counselling psychologist now. She trained on our programme, Nicola Farrar, who did a thesis on culture wars. in therapy and how comfortable people, how the issues of kind of how couched culture wars come into the therapy room and how well equipped people feel in that space. And it's the same pattern around, we may have some kind of core skills, but what do I do? Is it part of my role? Is it not part of my role? And I think for me, one of the biggest things we can start to do is open up conversations on training programs about how this comes into the room, to not shy away and to actually name it for what it is. Because I feel like if we don't name it for what it is, that's when it comes out in unhelpful ways. That's when things boil over, is when you haven't kind of named it for what it is. And also then people can practice, people can sit with that. I think that psychologists, talking therapists have a lot to offer in terms of helping society handle the situation we find ourselves in. But we just have to kind of figure out how to apply those skills, because we don't need to agree with people. We don't want all of our therapists thinking the same things necessarily. It's not the case that you have to have these views to come and train as a counselling psychologist or train as a CBT therapist or whatever. That's not what we want. But we do want people to be able to disagree in ways that are respectful and to be open and curious, genuinely curious about the other. But I do think it's a big challenge.
I feel like we need a pause for a round of applause for that. That was fantastic. One of the things I think is really important is exactly what you just said, which is that we don't want everyone to think the same thing. It's a bit cliche, but part of my kind of speech on day one when students arrive is that my job isn't to teach you what to think, it's to teach you how to think. So there's a curriculum, and you're going to be learning from experienced practitioners, but I don't want a load of mini-me's. Like I want you to be able to sort of watch different people practice and be open to different ideas and figure out your own way of practicing in the world. Now, I mean, it's hard to talk about this without just touching briefly on one of the things that I think has sort of happened in universities in recent years, that I feel like they've become a bit less free. There's certain, and I never ever thought in my lifetime that the biggest challenge to freedom of speech would come from the left, and I found that quite difficult to manage. That I think there's been a kind of, and I suppose it comes from the sort of critical end of the social justice literature, which feels quite authoritarian and quite dogmatic, and saying that there is a sort of right and wrong end of the argument to be on. And so I think like the rise of kind of cancellation culture and that kind of thing, I think it's stifled debate a little bit. I think we're over the worst of it. My university's got a really great kind of freedom of speech code, and it says exactly what Laura's just said, that we welcome diverse viewpoints. One of the things that I've found problematic is that this so-called call for diversity has been strangely undiverse. Like you can be diverse but not diverse in your views or your opinions. And so I feel like part of the job is to push back against that. And so just a few things that we've tried to incorporate sort of in the service of what Laura's calling for there have been a kind of brave space culture as opposed to a safe space culture. So this isn't safe, this training. You cannot expand your horizons and get outside of your comfort zone and learn a whole bunch of new skills and confront difficult topics and be completely safe. You've got to be kind of brave. And so there won't be any trigger warnings on this course. You can expect to be pushed outside of your comfort zone. We expect controversy with civility. We expect you to sort of own your intentions and your impact, and we expect you to participate. We've got reflective practice groups which are specifically about looking at issues of things like power and oppression and intersectionality. The teaching curriculum that we're given is so full, it's quite difficult to add in extra things, but we've got specific sessions on working with neurodiversity or looking at issues of race or working with older adults. So certain specific sessions on diversity issues, and try to sort of weave that in as well. We try in every teaching presentation to have at least a couple of slides on thinking about what diversity issues might be relevant here, or what kind of societal issues might be relevant here. Because I do think, the attempts to decolonise the curriculum, if you decolonised our curriculum, there'd be nothing left in it. All of it has come from, the UK pretty much, or America, by middle class, upper class men largely. So I think we do what we can. I'd agree with Laura. difficult and complex. I think we just encourage debate and we encourage viewpoint diversity as much as we possibly can. I feel like we're in a better place than we were a few years ago, and I feel like there's more work to do.
I agree with much of kind of what you've said there. I think the tricky thing for me is that I think sometimes the ideas around I have a right to think what I think and I have a right to say what I want, or things get a bit blurred. We need to think about how we say what we think, I guess. I think we do a similar thing in terms of, we talk about a pedagogy of discomfort. So, there is going to be some discomfort, as you say. You can't promise a safe space, but equally, if you're completely unsafe, then you're not going to be learning either. I think we do need to acknowledge that, at least in psychology, that, training has perpetuated a lot of harm for a lot of minoritized groups. And the parts of the curriculum around quote unquote diversity and difference have sometimes been to blame for some of that. I know that I've done a lot of learning in relation to that, and I think there's people doing brilliant work on it. There's somebody called Myra Khan who writes about working within diversity rather than working with diversity, and I think diversity as a word, certainly in kind of counselling psychotherapy world, became a little depoliticised at places, and also became quite othering. There was an assumption that you need to learn about working with these different groups. Our therapists may be normative, but you need to working with these different groups. And I think that, so there's real tensions about how we teach some of this, what we do with, as you say, the fact that psychology, again, as a discipline is, steeped in colonialism. I think there's something perhaps about not what we teach, but how we teach some of the time, and being open to different forms of knowledge, being open to different understandings of the world. But I do think it is really, really tricky. I don't want people to think that they can only be a therapist if they're left wing, because I don't think that's true. I think that we need to understand politics in its broadest sense. When I talk about our training programme being social justice informed, it doesn't mean that it's all people who think the same. But we definitely need to learn how to process and sit with some of these really challenging issues.
One thing that's come up in our discussion today is this idea that nothing exists within a vacuum. And I'm curious, considering that some of the discourse, potentially a lot of the discourse, depending on how your social media algorithms are programmed, can feel currently quite polarised. The word populist has rocketed in its usage. How have those more polarised elements of discourse outside the therapy room impacted on that level of discomfort or that level of fear around these conversations? And how has it impacted on therapeutic conversations in general, considering that we may want to be a bit more nuanced in terms of conversations that we have inside a therapeutic environment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, I suppose on the therapeutic conversation side of things, the other thing I'm always very keen to get in there when I have these conversations about politics and therapy is that, this isn't about telling people who to vote for. This isn't about going into the therapy room and saying, all your problems are because you're oppressed. That's a really poor caricature of what people who are talking in this area are saying. So, I mean, I do think you're right in terms of the nuance. I think the situation in the country is very, very messy in terms of identity and positionality at the moment. I mean, I think Richard's kind of hinted at some of that with the discussion about how universities are. One of my other roles is that I'm the EDI director for the school in which I'm based in the University of Manchester, and I can see this coming up there. The Supreme Court ruling making things very confusing in terms of how we're defining terms in the Equality Act. There's a lot of really difficult stuff floating around, I think, at the moment. And as you say, we're seeing more. I'm based in Derbyshire, but, my colleagues, some of them are based in the constituency where we have a by-election going on that's in the press every day. So there is there's a lot going on. And I think in times of increased kind of political heat, if you like, then that's necessarily going to translate through into both the teaching space, which is what I'm mostly encountering at the moment, and the therapeutic space. And I do think that, that you mentioned the algorithms and things, the way we are encountering politics is changing. The way in which we are thinking about politics is changing, and that shifts the whole landscape. If we learn about the news in different ways than people did 15 years ago, it's going to change what people think about electoral politics. If you're getting it from short video clips from various sources versus sitting down and watching one news provider. And I think there are good things about how politics is changing as well as bad things. It's really easy to focus on the bad things. I think there are some good things. I think my children give me an awful lot of hope in the world. The fact that my children can talk about sexism and racism and they're under 9, gives me a lot of hope in how things are changing. But I think the tensions are running very high. And again, I would hope that as talking therapists and psychologists, we can help people lean into that and to work with that tension. I don't think we always do that, but I would hope that we could. We've had a lot of conversations in the teaching team that I work within about how we can help groups of trainees when there are differences. When there are those moments where things creep in, challenging ways, how can the training space be a space where you help people to figure out how they react, respond, process differences in politics so that you're then equipped to do that in a room with a client, because you can learn so much from that relational space of training to take in there. But I think it's very challenging to do. I don't always think we've got it right, but I think that's one thing that I think is coming up, is that culture wars, however you want to frame it, there are hot topics, aren't there, that people all of a sudden have opinions on, but often they are about things that really, really impact people's lives. They're not just things that we can talk about in an abstract sense.
One thing that was just sort of showing up for me was the parallel, sort of polarized thinking is one of the things we're kind of trained to help clients recognize in themselves, as an unhelpful thinking style, that just seeing things in kind of all or nothing terms is generally not that helpful. But it seems to have, it's becoming a kind of societal, I don't know, sickness isn't the right word. It's something it's spread throughout society, probably largely as a consequence of social media and algorithms and the degrading of our attention, and that a lot of our information comes from short little, not very nuanced bursts of information. Yeah, there just seems like an interesting parallel there for me, that something that we've sort of thought of as being an individual level problem has actually become quite a big problem.
I'm also aware of, this idea sometimes that people should kind of, talk about things more calmly, or sometimes the reason people are struggling to talk about things calmly is because they've had a lifetime of oppression and, suffering at the hard end of societally structured disadvantage. Some of the moments I think we're seeing, I find particularly difficult to kind of check myself in, because I think, people are quite rightly angry, and who am I to say that they should calm that down and have a reasonable discussion? So I think there's a very complex picture of, yes, we do need to be able to, as I said before, be open, be curious, try and learn about the other rather than immediately jump to all the reasons why they're wrong. But that's, it's easier said than done in some spaces. And maybe we also need to think about who's put in that position and who has to be the one to have those conversations, because I don't think we can put it all on, some people are quite rightly sick of having to fight for their right to exist or their rights. So it feels like maybe I've gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I do think it connects with this, that we often, some of the polarisation on some of the issues I think has happened because minoritised groups' voices have been amplified in some ways, and that's a good thing. That is something that we should feel pleased about, but then gets kind of cast as part of the problem. It needs some analysis, I suppose, to think about how we can intervene in a way that helps with some of the polarisation. And there's lots of brilliant community organisations who are doing some of this work. They're getting people with really different life experiences and viewpoints together. And I think as a therapeutic profession, as a psychological profession, we could probably do more in that space to support that work, because it does seem like a pressing issue.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think it's hard, isn't it? It's just like for an individual. Like to use a personal example, like it's hard for me to be kind to the parts of myself that I don't like. Like I can be quite pleased and proud of qualities that I like about myself, but it's very easy for me to be self-critical about bits that I don't like. And I think that sort of occurs on a larger scale as well. Like it's really easy to be kind and compassionate and understanding to the people that you sort of identify with, and really easy to be really judgmental about the other. But just like it's, how am I going to find peace as an individual? Like I need to find ways of being kind and compassionate to parts of myself I don't like. It's exactly the same at a larger level, isn't it? It's easy to be, I don't know, compassionate to the Mexican kid who's being racially abused by someone on the sidewalk. However, in order, if we're going to make any progress, we sort of need to try and find some compassion and understanding for the guy that's doing the abusing. And that's really uncomfortable, isn't it? It's a really uncomfortable thing to even consider. Yet, if we're ever going to find a more united, less polarised society, we sort of need to be able to do both. And surely, of all the professions that might be well suited to help do that, you'd think we would be among them.
Just linking that last point that you made there, Rich, I think if we spin it back around to what's happening in the world of talking therapies, we've introduced mindfulness, right? Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And a big part of that is loving kindness, learning the skill, and it is a skill, isn't it, to offer compassion to those that present with very oppositional viewpoints to our own. And I think that's a brilliant step towards reducing some polarisation to some extent in a very small way within the talking therapies world. But we're a really long way off it because, so I'm really lucky, aren't I, to get to work with trainees in a supervisory capacity on the CBT course, and the self-critical therapist. I think that's a kind of commonality between all trainee therapists, really, really overtly self-critical. And yeah, until we can kind of step back from that and learn to show compassion to all bits, even the distasteful, unpleasant bits of ourselves, we can't really do that for others either, can we?
I think part of working with the fact that therapy is completely political involves looking at ourselves, right? I think it involves that reflexive process, and that's really uncomfortable sometimes. That's really difficult, hard, messy work that involves, for me, I have had to look in such uncomfortable ways at my whiteness, which by virtue of the society I live in, I didn't have to question it. It wasn't a thing. I didn't think about my being white for such a large portion of my life. And I need to. I need to look at how I am complicit in systems of racism. And that makes me both a better person and a better therapist. And, linking back to your earlier question around training, I think that's one of the things. I think in counselling psychology, at least on a lot of the programs I'm familiar, we do that fairly well. But I do think we could do it more, and we could do it more across the board in psychology and talking therapies to get people to really look at themselves and, what they're bringing into that space.
I think that's one of the weakest areas of the CBT training curriculum. There's a lot of focus on developing technical skills as a therapist, which is obviously necessary. And compared to some other psychotherapeutic trainings, it's relatively light on the kind of self-reflection, self-discovery kind of stuff. I outlined earlier a few ways in which we've tried to improve that, and I still think it's pretty weak compared to, say, counselling psychology training is a good kind of comparator, much better at that.
With that, and incorporating that element of reflection, introspection in terms of recognising one's background, recognising one's processes, an interesting few things showed up for me in preparation for today's episode. I'm conscious that occasionally clients might Google my name, might listen to episodes of the podcast, and I found myself thinking that I'm walking a bit of a tightrope here in terms of perhaps needing to keep my political affiliations under wraps, with the idea that I wouldn't want someone to walk into a session with me and feel excluded in any way because their beliefs might not match with mine in some way. And so I suppose, how much are we really saying here that in amongst the reflection on someone's background and their beliefs comes quite a significant responsibility of appearing politically neutral once they enter into the therapy room to make sure that no one's excluded?
I feel like the whole neutrality thing is just a massive myth in psychology and therapy. I feel like and again, I would probably say this because of my particular discipline and my positioning within it, but I think it has its roots in thinking of psychology as a science, of the links with the medical model and all those sorts of histories of the discipline. But I don't think we are neutral, and I don't think that is a bad thing. I don't think, as I said, I think we should be going in there telling people what to think, but I also don't think I could be neutral if I tried. In my very first answer to the questions this afternoon, I think I talked about how you bring it into the room. You bring who you are in the visible ways into the room, and you probably subtly communicate some of the invisible ways as well. So do I go into a therapeutic space and say, this is who I vote for and these are my opinions on some of the core issues of the day? No. But am I going to hide that? Probably also no. I think it really depends on the particular therapeutic conversation. I don't think that I could only be a successful therapist with people who think the same things as me, in the same way that I don't think I am only successful with people of the same gender or people with the same skin colour or whatever. I don't think that has to be the case. And I think sometimes you have points at which things become explicit and obvious in relationship and in dialogue, and then those are sometimes really fruitful and those are sometimes less so, and it really depends on the relationship. I can think of clients who I worked with early in my training who didn't want to work with me because of my age, or I had people who I had a really successful therapeutic relationship that I still stays with me from someone who initially didn't want to work with me because I was a woman. And we managed to successfully work through that. There was a lot that went into looking at that and exploring that, and it became part of it. And so in the same vein, I think I don't have to have the same opinions as the person I'm working with. And sometimes it's not going to be named explicitly ever. You know, saying that therapy is political does not mean that that's going to come in every time. But I do think it is. I think it would be a lie for me to say that I was aiming to be neutral, and I don't think anybody could be. And it really depends on how we frame it as well. There's this idea in humanistic therapy around being non-directive, and that gets a lot of, that's a far world away from your CBT therapy and in talking therapy services, but it also gets misunderstood an awful lot. It's often not about not directing the process, but it might be about not directing the content. So I think that, there's definitely one for me. I react to the idea of neutrality because I just don't think we are. I don't think we can be.
I wonder if some of it also comes from the kind of psychodynamic tradition of like the idea of therapists being a kind of blank slate against which you can sort of process all of this hidden stuff. I mean, without wanting to be disrespectful, I agree. I think it's nonsense, that really. I don't know what other people would think about this, because I feel like I'm on a journey with this and trying out different ways of addressing things with clients. But one of the things I've sort of started doing more of is deliberately sort of pointing out the differences between us early on, not as a way of sort of othering them, I hope, and you'd need to ask them, I guess, as to how it's received, but more like just saying something like, that there are some notable differences between us in terms of our backgrounds, and I wonder if there's anything you would like to say about that, or is anything that we might need to talk about in relation to that prior to sort of proceeding with therapy. And it's enabled people to say things like, well, I've heard you on your podcast and I know you're an atheist and I'm a Christian, and that maybe we should talk about that. Or you're a white man and you're a lot older than me and I'm a black woman, and I wonder if we should talk about that. And so I don't know. I don't feel like it's done any harm. I don't know, but it I guess it's almost the opposite of being neutral. It's like sort of bringing attention to the fact that we are likely to have different learning histories, different experiences, different worldviews, and it's not a bad thing. But let's just have it out in the open so that it's something we can discuss, should we need to.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there's this idea in the literature that I hate the name of, but people talk about broaching conversations around our kind of social differences, our identities. And that it does make it sound like it's something like dirty that you shouldn't really mention, but it does also fit with how people do respond to these issues, I think, sometimes. But there's this idea that we can do that in different ways. So sometimes therapists entirely ignore anything that gets mentioned, even if it's mentioned. I've seen in training times where people kind of kind of drop a little something in there and the therapist just passes on by. So there's ignoring, but there's sometimes responding kind of performatively. There's responding anxiously. There's bringing it in actively. We can have these kind of political, social, cultural, whatever you want to call them, conversations in lots of different ways. And I think there's an invitation in what you're saying, Rich, to being kind of just an invitation if people feel like that is relevant or that is something which connects without any kind of, I think without assumptions is an important thing. You know, like, I'm not going to make an assumption about what you might think or how you might behave based on the religion you've said you kind of connect with, because that might mean something different for other people. So why don't we talk about what it means for you? Or I'm not going to make assumptions about you based on your age or whatever. I think opening up those conversations is an important part of it, because then you can see where it's really relevant and where it's not.
I think two things that are very much shining brightly from this conversation today are the ideas of curiosity and openness in terms of having these discussions and developing an understanding of the meaning, which is, I think, as you touched on earlier, Laura, is kind of the bread and butter of what we do. And I suppose what we're really saying here is that this shouldn't be an area that's off limits to that same explorative nature that we generally hold.
I think what we're talking about fundamentally are some of the core therapeutic skills, qualities that are, well, I was going to say expected, or possibly could be present in every encounter. But, you know, like unconditional positive regard, just being with what the person's bringing in, being curious about that. That's no different whether we're talking about something from a social perspective, political perspective. We can really develop those skills as therapists. They are our core skills and our core qualities. And I wonder if we just place kind of greater emphasis on that at the beginning of a therapist journey, it might, I don't know, make some of those more challenging conversations, those difficult situations, easier to navigate. So, yeah.
I'm also just internally, as you were speaking there, Shell, just reflecting on, once again, the tension between the small p and the big P in terms of, particularly within an NHS talking therapies environment, acknowledging things like session limits, etc. How feasible always is it, I guess, to have that freedom and that time to shine a light on these areas whilst also continuing to move a treatment journey forward in the way that perhaps the system or perhaps senior staff members may want us to. I'm conscious of time, and I want to thank you both so much for your time and your input today. Laura, first of all, where can people find out more about you and your work? And to any trainees or therapists listening who may feel stuck with the political elephant in the room, what would your advice be to them?
I can answer the second part of that question so much better than the first. I'm not very great at self-publicism. I mean, I've got a staff profile on the University of Manchester website, so people can find my publications there. And one of the things I suppose that I would flag is that the marvellous Professor Divine Chirura up at York St John and I edited a handbook of social justice and psychological therapies, which was published in 2023, and that's something I'm very pleased we did, because it brings together quite a lot of the threads that we're talking about. In terms of the trainees, I mean, I think an elephant is only an elephant in the room if you haven't named it. It stops being that when you look at it and you draw attention to it. So I think there's a few things I would say. One is I do think reflexivity is absolutely paramount. I do think anything that trainees can do to learn more about themselves, even when it's uncomfortable, will always, that's going to make you a better therapist, essentially, because you are the tool in that room, one of the tools in that room. So I think reflexivity is fundamental. Definitely not forgetting the kind of the socio-political part of what somebody is presenting with. We don't have to fix them, we probably can't fix them, but if we tell the story that it's all about other things, then we're going to shift the focus to a very individualised understanding of distress, and just keep learning. I mean, I'm learning constantly about this stuff. The more I read, the longer my reading list gets. But I think it's an important area, and one in which we shouldn't expect other people to always educate us. I think, speaking for myself as an academic and someone who, I said at the start, I've got lots of socially structured advantages, along with some other stuff as well. I think on the stuff where I am not minoritised, on the stuff where I haven't experienced oppression, I've got a responsibility to learn about that, and it will make me a better member of society as well as a better psychologist.
I think everyone freezes a little bit when we ask them to self-promote, so that's totally understandable. We will put a link to your University of Manchester profile in the show notes if anyone wants to check that out and see any of the things that you've been working on. Same question to you, Rich. Where can people find out more about you? And again, what would your advice be to those trainees or therapists who may be struggling with this?
I feel underqualified to answer the second part. I'm probably going to, again, at the risk of sounding really sycophantic, say go to Laura's staff profile. It's a really good... Are they all like that at the university? They're really good staff profiles, aren't they? You've got all the links to your publications are right there. It's better than my staff profile. So I've got a staff profile. It's at the University of Birmingham. I'm not sure it's really worth looking at. But if people want to get in touch, my private practice website is Think Psychology, and I have a training company, Activating Your Practice, which is focused on acceptance and commitment therapy. Yeah, that's me.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much to both of you for your time today. An absolutely fascinating conversation, and we hope you'll both be back on at some point soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.